A good day to all of you. Today we will be discussing about the physiology of respiratory system part 1. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to list the muscles of breathing, describing the changes in the volume and pressure associated with inspiration and expiration. We will be describing about the structure of the respiratory membrane. Then we'll be explaining about the function and significance of surfactant. You should be able to list out the factors that affect the ventilation and respiration. You should be able to define the lung volumes and capacities. This is the structural anatomy of the respiratory system. You might have already learned this in the anatomy, so I'm not going into the details of the anatomical structures. So only thing you need to remember each part, right, starting from the nose to the alveoli, how the different pathways are taking the air into the respiratory system, and what are the different structures included in that. Pulmonary ventilation and respiration. Ventilation is the process of breathing. It is the movement of air into and out of the lung. It supplies oxygen to the alveoli and eliminates carbon dioxide from the body. It has two phases, the inspiration, which means it is the moving of air into the lung, and expiration, which means it is the moving of air out of the lung. In respiration, there is exchange of gases, the oxygen and carbon dioxide, between body cells and the external environment. This involves pulmonary ventilation, which means it is breathing pulmonary ventilation, and also the exchange of gases. In this particular picture, you can see different types of pressures. We'll be explaining about the different types of pressures here. The first pressure we are going to describe is about the atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure is the pressure within the atmosphere. That is, it is outside the body, the pressure of the atmosphere where we live. And then we can see the structure of the lung. As you know that the lung it's covered by a particular layer which is called as a pleura, which is composed of two layers. So you can see that pleura, the outer layer, which is called as a parietal pleura, which is closely attached to the thoracic wall. This is the thoracic wall. So you can see that closely attached to the thoracic wall, there is a layer which is called as a parietal pleura. And there is also an innermost layer which is called as the visceral pleura, which is closely attached to the lung. So to the lung, that layer which is attaching, the pleural layer which is attaching, which is called as a visceral layer. The outer layer is called as a parietal layer. And in between the visceral layer and the parietal layer, there is a space, and that space is called as a pleural cavity or pleural space. And there is a small amount of fluid within the pleural cavity or the pleural space. This space is having a pressure which is called as intrapleural pressure. Intra means it is inside, right? So here you can see that intrapleural pressure is the pressure within the pleural cavity. That is, it is between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. That pressure is called as an intrapleural pressure. And within the alveoli or within the lungs, that pressure is called as intraalveolar pressure. That is the pressure within the lung. Now if you take a difference between this pressure, that is the intraalveolar pressure, and intrapleural pressure, if you take a difference between these two, it gives you another pressure which is called as a transpulmonary pressure. So the transpulmonary pressure is the difference between intrapleural pressure and intraalveolar pressure or intrapulmonary pressure. This intraalveolar pressure is also called as intrapulmonary pressure, right? Both are same, intraalveolar pressure or intrapulmonary pressure, which means it's the pressure within the lungs, within the alveoli. And the intra-pleural pressure is the pressure within the pleural cavity. If you take the difference between these two, intra-alveolar pressure and intra-pleural pressure, it gives to transpulmonary pressure. So these are the pressures which you need to know. So you remember once again these pressures: atmospheric pressure, intra-alveolar pressure, intra-pleural pressure, and the transpulmonary pressure. So these four pressures you need to remember. Now we'll just see the relationship between the pleural sac and the lung. So this already I have explained in the previous picture, that the pleural space is between the visceral layer and the parietal layer. So you can see that there is an example which is given versus air-filled balloon, which represents the alveoli, and this represents the pleura. That means this will be the visceral pleura, which is closely attached to the lung, and this will be the parietal pleura, which is closely attached to the chest wall or the thoracic wall. And in between that, these two layers, there is a space which is called as a pleural space. So pleural space is there, and between that, between the visceral layer of and the parietal layer, you get the pleural space with a small amount of fluid which is called as a pleural fluid. This is a very important slide to remember how the process of respiration will take place. This is an experimental model. On the left hand side you can see this is an experimental model which exactly resembles that of how our lungs will be functioning. So you can see that this particular piece of like balloon which is kept here, that represents the diaphragm, and inside this balloon represents the lung, which is externally connected, so through the trachea, and which is connected to outside. So that's an experimental model that very clearly explains how our lungs functions. Now suppose the diaphragm is pulled down. So the contraction of the diaphragm, first thing which will be happening is a contraction of the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is pulled down. So what will happen is the vertical diameter, this is the vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity. If this is the thoracic cavity, whenever the diaphragm is pulled down like this, the vertical diameter will be increasing. When the vertical diameter increases, that will be causing a fall in the pressure within the thoracic cavity. As a result, from high pressure area to low pressure area, there is movement of air. That means from outside the pressure is very high, and inside the pressure is very low. So from high pressure area to low pressure area, there will be passive movement of air. So the first event which is happening during respiration is contraction of diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, the external intercostal muscle. This will be contracting, and these muscles, when it contract, the thoracic volume increases. When thoracic volume increases, the pressure within the thoracic cavity decreases or falls. Then from higher pressure outside, the air will be rushing into the thoracic cavity. And the opposite event will be happening when the diaphragm relaxes and go back to its original position. When the diaphragm go back to its original position, the volume of thoracic cavity decreases, the pressure within the thoracic cavity increases, and as a result there will be movement of air which will be moving from the thoracic cavity into outside, which we will term as expiration. So that's the process which is happening during inspiration and expiration. It is just based on the pressure gradient. There will be movement of air. But remember, the contraction of the muscles, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, are important for bringing about inspiration. That is the reason why inspiration is always called as an active process, whereas expiration is always referred as a passive process, because we don't require active contraction of the muscles there. It is just relaxation of muscles and going back to the old stage. So that's all about the inspiration and expiration. Now let us see the pressure relations in the thoracic cavity, which we have already seen in the previous slide also. You need to remember that these are the various pressures. parietal pleura and visceral pleura. In between the space is the pleural cavity, and that space is usually called as the intrapleural pressure, right? The pressure which is there in the intrapleural cavity or the pleural cavity is called as an intrapleural pressure. It is approximately minus 4 millimeters of mercury or 756 millimeters of mercury. The transpulmonary pressure is the difference between the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure. So that difference is called as a transpulmonary pressure. It's about 4 millimeters of mercury. And always remember, intrapleural pressure is always subatmospheric. That means it is having a negative value, right? Minus 4 millimeters of mercury. So it's a subatmospheric, which means it is less than the atmospheric pressure. And intrapulmonary pressure 760 millimeters or 0 millimeters of mercury. So that is within the pleural cavity. So intrapulmonary or intraalveolar pressure is this. Intrapulmonary or intraalveolar. So that is the pressure within the alveoli, and usually that equalizes with the atmospheric pressure. This equalizes with the atmospheric pressure. Intrapleural pressure, remember, it is always negative. That is why here you can see this is negative, minus 4. It's always negative. And it is seen between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. The transpulmonary pressure, that is the difference between the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure. That is this pressure, this particular pressure, you can see that transpulmonary pressure. So it's actually the pressure difference between inside the lung and outside the lung. So this part is the intrapleural pressure and this part is the intrapulmonary pressure. If you take a difference, that gives you transpulmonary pressure, and that is the pressure that keeps the alveoli to kept open. You can see that this is very important here. Keeps the air spaces of the lung open, that is, it keeps the lungs from collapsing. The size of the transpulmonary pressure determines the size of the lung. The greater the transpulmonary pressure, the better the size of the lung will be. That means the size of the alveoli is purely dependent on the transpulmonary pressure. If you have a greater transpulmonary pressure, you can expect that the alveoli will be kept wide open. If you have a less transpulmonary pressure, the size of the alveoli will be shortened or smaller. So this particular picture also, it gives the importance of different pressures. If the intrapleural pressure is equalized with the intrapulmonary pressure or atmospheric pressure, usually what is seen is there is a collapse of the lung. Because the lungs are in separate cavities, one lung can collapse without affecting another lung. Sometimes you might be seeing that only one lung of the individual will be collapsed. Both lungs together will not be happening, but one lung alone. So in this picture also you can appreciate that one lung is collapsed, whereas this is a healthy lung here, right? So that is how it is taking place, because both lungs are in the separate cavities like this. So this is just the pressure and volume relations based on the Boyle's law, which we have already explained before also. So this particular picture also, you can see that whenever the volume of the compartment decreases, the pressure will increase, right? So this is which is happening during the expiration. When the volume decreases, the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, because the diaphragm will go back to its original position. The volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, the pressure increases inside the thoracic cavity. That means from higher pressure to lower pressure there will be movement. So here higher pressure is within the thoracic cavity, so it will be moving from inside to outside. Now what will happen during the inspiration? During the inspiration, when you can see the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. Why? Because first thing what is happening is the diaphragm will be pulling down and the external intercostal muscles will be contracting, and that will cause the thoracic wall to expand. When the thoracic wall is expanded, the volume within the thoracic cavity will be higher. When volume is higher, the pressure falls. So from high pressure, to low pressure, there will be movement of air. That means the high pressure is in the atmosphere. So from the atmosphere, there will be movement of air which is happening, which will be entering into the lungs. So that is the inspiration. So from high pressure to low pressure, there is always movement of gases, so that is following the law of diffusion. This particular picture shows the inspiratory phases and how the thoracic volume is affecting the pressure. You can see that the inspiratory muscles diaphragm will be contracting and it will be descending down, and the rib cage rises. So here you can see the diaphragm which will be contracting down, moving down, and it will be increasing the vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity. The ribs will be elevating, so the ribs are elevated and the sternum flares as the external intercostals contract. When these events happens, you'll be seeing that the thoracic volume will increase. As a result, the pressure inside the thoracic cavity decreases and the air enters inside and the lungs are stretched. Intrapulmonary volume increases, intrapulmonary pressure drops, and as a result, there is a movement of air into the lungs. So this is the process of inspiration which is taking place, and it is based on the Boyle's law. This slide once again explains that whenever during inspiration, the first event which is happening is the contraction of the diaphragm, and diaphragm moves down. As a result, the thoracic volume increases and the pressure inside the thoracic cavity falls, and from higher pressure to lower pressure there is a movement of air, that is from the outside to inside there is a movement, that the result will be rushing of air into the lung down the pressure gradient. Accessory muscles of breathing becomes active in the inspiration process. The muscles like scalene muscles, sternocleidomastoid, pectoralis minor of the chest, these muscles will be involved in forceful inspiration. Then those muscles will be also, accessory muscles will be raising the ribs more to accommodate the large volume of gas. So usually this will be used in forceful inspiration. Now let us see what are the changes that happens in the thoracic volume during expiration. Expiration is the process by which the person breathes out. So in this case, what is seen is the diaphragm will go back to its original position, thereby it will be decreasing the thoracic volume, and according to the Boyle's law, when the thoracic volume decreases, the pressure within the thoracic volume will increase, and from high pressure to low pressure there will be movement of air. That means from the lungs air will start leaving outside. So you can see that the inspiratory muscles relaxes, diaphragm raises, rib cage will come back or recoil back, and then finally thoracic cavity volume decreases, elastic recoil passively increases, the intrapulmonary volume decreases, then intrapulmonary pressure rises. So pressure inside the thoracic cavity increases. As a result, according to the diffusion of gases, air will be flowing from the lungs down its pressure gradient. Expiration is a quiet process or a passive process, and inspiration is an active process. Here it is depending on the elasticity of the lung. Here you can see the lungs recoil following inspiration. Both thoracic and intrapulmonary volumes decreases, compression of alveoli with corresponding rise in the pulmonary pressure to 1 millimeters of mercury above the atmospheric pressure. The pressure gradient forces the gases to flow out of the lung. So that is the events which is taking place during the expiration. During forceful expiration, which is an active process produced by the contraction of the abdominal wall, the oblique muscles and transverse abdominis muscles. So these muscles are contracted during forceful expiration. It increases the intra-abdominal pressure, forcing the abdominal organ against the diaphragm. Depression of the rib cage the internal intercostal muscles, which decreases the thoracic volume. Decrease in the volume causes an increase in the intrapulmonary pressure, which forces air out of the lungs. So these are the muscles involved in the forceful expiration. That means for the normal quiet expiration, the quiet expiration means it's a normal expiration. So for normal expiration, we don't require any muscles. But in the case of forceful expiration, we requires the contraction of these muscles. Forcefully, we are allowing the movement of air from the lungs to outside. So that requires these muscles. So the internal intercostal muscles and the abdominal muscles are usually used or contracted only during the forceful expiration, whereas in the normal expiration it will not be contracted. This slide is very important because you have all the muscles and its functions here. So let us go one by one. The major muscles of inspiration, which will be the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. And that is the reason that this inspiration is always called as an active process, because it requires the contraction of these muscles, and that is the how it will be changing the volume and the pressures within the thoracic cavity. And the muscles in the accessory muscles of inspiration, that will be contracting only during forceful inspiration, right? These are these muscles, sternocleidomastoids and scalenus, only during forceful inspiration, when you are taking extra amount of air, like forcefully. So in such cases, there will be contraction of these muscles. Then I mentioned that the expiration is a passive process. It doesn't require any muscles to be contracted. But if you are doing a forceful expiration, it requires the contraction of the muscle. So you can see here, these are the muscles, and this will be contracting only during active expiration. That means it is forceful expiration. That is abdominal muscles and also the internal intercostal muscles. So these muscles will be contracting only during forceful expiration, but in a passive expiration or a quiet expiration, you don't see that these muscles will be contracting. This particular slide shows about the various pressures and volume changes during the normal breathing. You can see that the intrapulmonary pressure, this is the intrapulmonary pressure which is mentioned during the inspiration. So this phase is the inspiratory phase. You can see that from 0 it is changing to -1 during the inspiration. Why it is changing from 0 to -1? Here, because there is an increase in the thoracic volume during the inspiratory phase, and as a result the pressure falls. What happens to the expiratory phase? You can see that this is the expiratory phase. It is increasing to +1. It is increasing to +1 millimeters of mercury. Why the pressure increases during expiration? That is because when the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles relaxes, the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, and as a result the pressure increases. That's the reason why you are seeing an increase in the intrapulmonary pressure during expiration, and in this case there is a decrease of intrapulmonary pressure during inspiration. So that's the changes or the phasic changes during the inspiration and expiration. You will be seeing that phasic changes of intrapulmonary pressure. Then we can see the intrapleural pressure, that is the pressure within the pleural cavity. That is the intrapleural pressure. You can see that it is -4, it is becoming more negative to -6. From -4 it is going to more negative to a value of -6. Here in the phase of inspiration it is becoming more negative, whereas in the case of expiration you can see that it is becoming less negative, but it is never going to become a positive value. See, it is becoming less negative in the case of expiration, but it is not going to become a positive value, right? So that is the pleural pressure. So intrapleural pressure, it is always subatmospheric or below the atmospheric pressure. That is the pressure which is seen within the pleural cavity between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. And the difference between the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure, that is called as a transpulmonary pressure. Transpulmonary pressure, and that is that pressure which will make sure the size of the alveoli will be determined by that particular pressure. If the transpulmonary pressure is greater, you can see that the size of the alveoli will be larger. And if the transpulmonary pressure is smaller or the gradient is very less, you can see that the size of the alveoli decreases in size. And the last part, which shows that the volume, it is just the volume of air that is taken in and air during the normal breathing. This is the tidal volume. It is approximately 0.5 liters or 500 ml. So these are about the pressure, various pressures which you need to remember. External respiration occurs in the lungs. Oxygen diffuses into the blood while carbon dioxide leaves the blood and enters the lungs. So in this picture you can see that diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli into the blood vessel. So this one is the pulmonary capillaries, and you can see that carbon dioxide is leaving. Factors influencing external respiration: partial pressure gradient and gas solubilities. The pressure exerted by each individual gas in the mixture is called as the partial pressure. Partial pressure is directly proportional to the percentage of the gas in the mixture. A gas will dissolve in fluid in proportion to its partial pressure, that is, the direction and the amount of movement of a gas is determined by its partial pressure in the gas and liquid phases. The structural characteristics of respiratory membrane is also one of the important factors that determines the external respiration. This particular slide just basically explains about the impact of the partial pressure and the diffusion. You can see that the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is 104 millimeters, and the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 in the pulmonary capillary. There is a huge pressure gradient of approximately 60 millimeters of mercury, which drives the movement of oxygen to diffuse from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. Right, so that will be happening. And as soon as the oxygen diffuses rapidly from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillary blood, it will be within 0.25 seconds an equilibrium is attained. That means all the oxygen, whatever is entering, it will be immediately equilibrated with the RBC. The hemoglobin is present within the RBC, so it will be picking up the oxygen from the blood, which is from the blood of the capillary blood, as soon as it diffuses from the alveoli, and it is very fast or quick in action, and that will be because of the large pressure gradient. Another thing is that carbon dioxide is approximately 20 times more soluble when compared to the oxygen. This is also so the solubility also matters, which depends upon how fast the diffusion is taking place. Now this is a structure of a respiratory membrane. You can see that there is a type 1 cells, which are the respiratory epithelial cells, and there is another important cell which are called as a type 2 cells, which secretes a substance called surfactant. They are surfactant secreting cells that prevents the collapse of the alveoli, So they are called as surfactant secreting cells or type 2 cells. Surfactant reduces the surface tension within the alveoli and it prevents the alveolar collapse. It decreases the effort of breathing, and usually it is seen that the surfactant will begin its secretion around 7th month of intrauterine life. Sometimes there is a kind of disease condition which is called as an infant respiratory distress syndrome or IRDS, which means they are premature babies which has lack of surfactant, which doesn't have the surfactant, right? So that is a infant respiratory distress syndrome. So these babies which are born with lack of surfactant, there'll be collapse of their lung. The lung will be collapsing because of high surface tension. Surfactant replacement therapy has proven survival rates to be increased. Now it is about the pulmonary function test or the spirometry, which will be discussed in the spirometry lectures and the laboratory lectures to you. So I'm just skipping the next 4 slides because it's included in your lab manual and it will be discussed during the laboratory discussions. And also you need to just remember that spirometer is used to measure the lung volumes and capacities, right? So that is one of the important lung function tool that is clinically accepted. So the details we will look later, and now I'll be skipping these 4 slides. So this also we will be doing during the spirometry discussions. This also again we will be doing during the spirometry discussion. Yes. Now let us see about the distribution of pulmonary ventilation. From here you can see that the conducting zone or dead space, which means that when the air is moving through the airways before it reaches the alveoli, it will be moving through all these parts, right? Trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and finally to the alveolar sacs. But before reaching here, it has to go through all these layers, all these particular pathways, right? So this pathway will be having, it will be filled with air, and that particular air is not taking part in the gaseous exchange because gaseous exchange is taking place only during the alveolar sacs. But the air which is there in that particular pathway which is not taking part in the gaseous exchange, that is called as a dead space air, and it is approximately 150 ml in a healthy individual. Not all expired, not all inspired air reaches the alveoli. Some remains in the conducting zone, which means that whatever is remaining here, it is not taking part in the gaseous exchange because gaseous exchange is taking place in the alveoli, right? So this particular air which is not used in the gaseous exchange, that is called as a dead space air. And the volume of air does not participate in the exchange, gaseous exchange. We have already seen what is an anatomical dead space of that 150 ml of air. That 150 ml of air which is there in the conducting zone, which is not taking part in the gaseous exchange, is called as an anatomical dead space. You can see that the volume of air that reaches the alveoli and that is involved in the gaseous exchange, this is approximately 350 ml. That means 500 ml is the tidal volume. If you subtract 150 ml, which is the dead space air, you get this 350 ml, which is the actual exchange which is taking place within the alveoli. So this 350, how you're getting is your 500 minus 150. 500 is the tidal volume and 150 ml is the anatomical dead space which is not taking part in the gaseous exchange. So if you subtract that, you are getting 350. It is that volume of air that reaches the alveoli and it is involved in the gaseous exchange. So this is also called as an alveolar ventilation. When you will be multiplying that with the respiratory rate, you get the alveolar ventilation for that. What determines the ease of air flows? The relaxation or contraction of the circular muscles is the one which decides the bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction. Bronchodilation is the process by which the ease of breathing is or the airflow is improved. When you have larger airways, it is easy to breathe. When you have a constricted airway, it is difficult to breathe. So bronchoconstriction is one of the important feature in conditions like bronchial asthma, where the breathing becomes difficult or labored. Obstruction to the airways in terms of mucus or infectious material or fluid, as in COPD. COPD means it is chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. It's a group of diseases which is coming under that category. Pulmonary ventilation. So this particular slide shows how you calculate the pulmonary ventilation. So in this formula, pulmonary ventilation is obtained by multiplying the tidal volume to the respiratory rate. Respiratory rate is how much breaths the individual is taking per minute, and tidal volume is 500 is the normal range. So it is approximately 12. You can see that the respiratory rate is 12 to 20 breaths per minute is the normal. So in this case, 500 multiplied by 12, around 6000 ml per minute is the pulmonary ventilation. Normal respiratory rate, it is about 12 to 20. So here it is written 18, but it can be different books gives different values, but 12 to 20 is an acceptable range. Thank you. So that's all about this particular chapter. We will be discussing further on a live stream session to clarify your doubts on this. Thank you so much for your listening.